Consistent with our release approach, we're going to precede the release of the headline figures with the definition and approaches that we use for the computation of gross domestic product. We share with you the various data sources that we get for the computation of gross domestic product for all three sectors: agricultural, industry, and services sector. We move on to the data compilation and estimation processes. Unique to this release, we share with you revisions that we've done for the first quarter of 2023. So in this release, we're not sharing with you provisional estimates for the second quarter of 2023, but the revised figures for the provisional estimates for the first quarter of 2023. We proceed with provisional GDP estimates for the second quarter of 2023, do disaggregations based on the various sectors, and end today's release with highlights of the second quarter GDP estimates. Gross domestic product indicates, or it's a measure of the value of final goods and services that are produced in the country irrespective of the nationality. So it means that it's a measure of the value of final goods and services produced by both nationals and non-nationals. Theoretically, there are three approaches for the computation of GDP: the production, expenditure, and the income approach. Ghana is yet to compute GDP from the income approach. Currently, we are computing GDP from both the production and the expenditure approach. Emphasis is the production approach, which we do on both quarterly basis and annual basis, and the expenditure approach, which we do on annual basis. The production approach is simply estimated based on the sum of gross value added from all the three sectors, as I indicated earlier on, this is done both from an annually and a quarterly perspective. And the expenditure approach estimates the sum of expenditure on the final value of goods and services, and this is mainly done on annual basis. Unlike our other statistics that Ghana Statistical Service gets into the field for the computation of the various statistics, GDP data is obtained from the various government ministries, departments, and agencies. So across the three sectors, we've identified the various ministries, departments, and agencies that provide Ghana Statistical Service with the relevant data for the computation of GDP at the sectoral level and also at the national level. For the agriculture sector, data is obtained mainly from the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and also from the ministries of from the Forestry Commission and the Fishery Commission. Crops data is obtained from the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, as well as livestock, and data for forestry and fishing are respectively obtained from the Forestry Commission and the Fishery Commission. Data for the industry sector is obtained mainly from the Minerals Commission, where we obtain the mining and quarrying data, of which oil and gas is a subcomponent of the mining and quarrying subsector under the industry subsector broadly. Data is obtained from the Ghana National Petroleum Commission. We use value-added tax information from the Ghana Revenue Authority for data on manufacturing, and the Volta River Authority provides us with the data on electricity. The last two subsectors in the industry sector are water and sewage and construction, of which data is respectively obtained from the Ghana Water Company. And the main item that we use as a measure for quarterly construction data is cement, which we obtain from the cement producing factories and import of cement. We've identified 11 subsectors in the services subsector, and the main data source for the services subsector is the value-added tax from the Ghana Revenue Authority. Respectively, the subsectors within the services subsector that we rely on value-added tax from the Ghana Revenue Authority are trade, repair of vehicles and household goods, hotels and restaurants, transport and storage, real estate, professional admin support services, and other personal service activities. And all these 6 subsectors under the services subsector, we rely on data on value-added tax from the Ghana Revenue Authority. The Ministry of Finance provides us with data for 2 subsectors, respectively, public administration, defense and social security, and education. We also rely on the Accountant General Department for data from health and social work, and also the National Communication Authority and the Central Bank for the subsectors information and communication and financial and insurance activities. GDP estimates are produced progressively Initially, we produced the data using the provisional figures like we're doing for the second quarter of 2023. Subsequent, based on data availability that we received from the government ministries, department, and agencies, we revised these figures, and within a 2-year period, we produced the final figures of the GDP estimate. In today's release, GDP is going to be computed from a single time perspective, specifically for the second quarter of 2023 over the period April, May, June 2023. So today's estimate is quarterly GDP, which is simply a measure of the value of final goods and services over the 3-month period April, May, June 2023. Computation is done from different perspectives and different adjustments. Since the exploration of oil, Ghana Statistical Service always produce the overall GDP, which we term oil GDP, and once we discount the effect of oil, we term it non-oil GDP. So GDP estimates are produced from 2 perspectives, oil and a non-oil GDP, where the overall GDP inclusive of oil is termed as oil GDP, and once we discount the effect of oil, we term it non-oil GDP. We also do GDP from a gold and a non-gold perspective, GDP from basic prices and purchases value. This allows us to take into consideration the effect of indirect taxes and subsidies, and that is the major distinction between GDP from the basic prices perspective and the purchases value perspective. In order to account for the effect of price changes, we estimate GDP from both a current perspective and a constant perspective, where the constant GDP is where we've discounted the effect of price changes over time and taken into consideration the actual changes in the value of goods and services. GDP is estimated from 2 time perspectives, either relative quarters within the period or on a year-on-year basis. So we're going to share with you GDP for the period second quarter of 2023 relative to the second quarter of 2022, which gives us a year-on-year perspective, and also on a quarterly basis we compare the second quarter of 2023 with the previous quarters. Once we're doing quarter-on-quarter GDP, it's appropriate we correct for seasonalities. So when we are releasing the quarter-on-quarter GDP, the figures have been adjusted for seasonalities over the 12-month period. GDP estimates for the period first quarter 2013 to last quarter 2021 have been finalized, and in today's release, as was indicated earlier, we have revised the first quarter of 2023. So the figure that we're going to share with you will be revised figures for the first quarter of 2023, in addition to the provisional figures for the second quarter of 2023. In the first quarter of 2023, we did indicate that from an oil perspective, the economy grew by 4.2% and 3.3% relative to the 4.2 for oil GDP and 5.5 for non-oil GDP. From a services point of view, we saw a significant drop from 10.1 to 6.3, and this is mainly attributed to the changes that we saw, additional data that we got from the perspective of compensation. Also, we saw an increase from the agricultural sector, mainly from crops, increasing from 4.8% to 6.4%, and also an improvement in the figures for industry, where the initial figures saw a contraction of 3.2% relative to 2.6%. So the headline figures for the first quarter of 2023, oil GDP, indicate that we saw a provisional figure growth rate of 4.2% from an oil perspective, and the revised growth rate for the first quarter of 2023 is 3.3% relative to the 4.2 that was announced for the first quarter of 2023. From a non-oil perspective, we see a revision from 5.5% to 4.4%, indicating a 1.1 difference between the provisional figure that was recorded for the first quarter of 2023 relative to the revised figure of 4.4 from a non-oil perspective. From a seasonally adjusted perspective, we see a 0.3% variation between the provisional figure, which was 1.1% for the first quarter of 2023, relative to the revised figure of 0.8 as a quarter-on-quarter seasonally adjusted figure for the first quarter of 2023. We now share with you provisional GDP estimates for the period April to June 2023, keeping in mind 2013 as the base year period. We start with current prices from an oil and a non-oil perspective. From an oil perspective, provisional 2023 quarter 2 GDP estimate stands at 185.7 billion for the second quarter of 2023 relative to 130.7 billion for the same period, second quarter 2022, indicating about a 55 billion difference between 2022 quarter 2 and 2023 quarter 2. Then from an oil perspective, for the period April to June 2023, a non-oil GDP recorded 175.1 billion Ghana cedis for the second quarter of 2023 relative to 121.4 billion for the same period, second quarter 2022. Turning to the adjustment for prices, GDP in constant terms, for the period April to June 2023, second quarter 2023, we recorded 42.1 billion for the second quarter of 2023 relative to 40.8 billion for the same period, second quarter 2022, indicating a 1.3 billion difference in terms of value of GDP constant terms between 2022 and 2023. From a non-oil perspective, 39.7 billion for the second quarter of 2023 relative to 38.5 billion for the same period, second quarter of 2022. From a constant perspective, oil GDP grew in the second quarter by 3.2%, and this indicates a 0.3 percentage drop for the same growth rate that was recorded for the second quarter of 2022. In the second quarter of 2022, the economy grew by 3.5%, and in the second quarter of 2023, we have seen the economy growing by 3.2%, indicating a slowdown in the growth rate relative to the same period, second quarter 2022. From a non-oil perspective, we equally recorded a growth rate of 3.2% between the second quarter of 2022 and the second quarter of 2023. This indicates a 1.6 percentage point slowdown for the period 2021 quarter 2 relative to 2022 quarter 2. Between the period 2021 quarter 2 and 2022 quarter 2, the economy grew by 4.8%, and between the period second quarter 2022 and second quarter 2023, the economy grew by 3.2%, indicating a 1.6 percentage point slowdown in the growth rate of the economy. We now turn to the real growth rate over the period second quarter 2021 to the second quarter of 2023. In the second quarter of 2023, from both an oil perspective and a non-oil perspective, the economy grew by 3.2%. From an oil perspective, the 3.2% that we've recorded for the second quarter of 2023 indicates a 0.1 slowdown relative to what we recorded in the first quarter of 2023. In the first quarter of 2023, the economy grew by 3.3%, and in the last quarter of 2022, the economy grew by 3.7%. Over these three quarters, the 3.2 indicates the lowest growth rate, as the economy grew by 3.7 in the last quarter of 2022 and 3.3 in the first quarter of 2023. From a non-oil perspective, the 3.2 growth rate that has been recorded for the second quarter of 2023 indicates a slowdown relative to the last two quarters. As from a non-oil perspective, in the last quarter of 2022, the economy grew by 4.3%, increased marginally to 4.4% in the first quarter of 2023, and a dip of 1.2 percentage points to 3.2 growth rate non-oil perspective for the second quarter of 2023. From a sectoral point of view, using the GDP at basic prices, we continue to see the dominance of the services sector, which has a share of 44.6% for the second quarter of 2023, followed by the industry sector 32.8% and the agricultural sector 22.6%. The 44.6% share of the services sector that we recorded for the second quarter of 2023 indicates a slowdown in its share, as the first quarter of 2023 indicated a share of 47% for the services subsector. Turning to the growth rate across the different sectors, the agricultural sector for the second quarter of 2023 grew by 6.0%, and also the services sector grew by 6.3% for the second quarter of 2023. While we saw a growth rate for agricultural and services sector, respectively 6.0 and 6.3% for the second quarter of 2023, the industry sector contracted by 1.9%, for the second quarter of 2023. These growth rates relative to the average for the period 2014 quarter 1 to second quarter 2023, we see increases for the second quarter of 2023 for agricultural and services sectors, while we see a slowdown or a contraction for the industry sector as it contracted by 1.9% relative to an average of 3.9% for the industry sector for the period first quarter 2014 to second quarter 2023. From a non-oil perspective and an oil perspective, we see that the growth rate that we recorded for the second quarter of 2023 is about 1.0 percentage point lower than the average for the period first quarter 2024 to second quarter 2023. So these growth rates are much lower than the average for the period for first quarter 2014 to second quarter 2023. From a sector perspective, and the subsectors within the three broad sectors, with the agricultural sector growing by 6.0 for the second quarter of 2023. This growth rate was largely as a result of the 12.2% growth rate in the fishing subsector, and also the slowdown was attributed to the forestry and logging subsector, which contracted by 4.2% in the second quarter of 2023. The crop subsector, of which cocoa is a subcomponent of it, grew by 6.3% on a year-on-year basis in the second quarter of 2023. The growth rate in the fishing subsector was mainly as a result of an increase in marine fishing and also aquaculture, which respectively grew by 20% and 25%. And we recorded a decrease in inland fishing for the second quarter of 2023. We now turn to these two subsectors within the agriculture sector. That is the fishing subsector that grew by 12.2% for the second quarter of 2023, and the forestry and logging subsector that contracted by 4.2% in the second quarter of 2023. From a trend perspective, on a quarter-on-quarter basis, we fail to observe any discernible pattern for the last 5 years for the fishing subsector. With a growth rate of 12.2% in the second quarter of 2023, this is coming on the back of a contraction in the last quarter of 2022 and the first quarter